Hello everyone and welcome to the Dyslexia Life Hack Show. I'm your host Matthew Head, and on today's episode we're talking to Dr. Deborah Leveroy. She's the Neurodiversity and Inclusion Lead at Dyslexia Box. She has a background in acting and coaching. She's also got a PhD in philosophy, so there's going to be plenty to talk about in this episode. I will post links to some of the things we talk about in the show notes, which will be available at dyslexialifehacks.com/podcast. Welcome to the show, Deborah.
Hi, Matthew. Thanks for having me.
That's no problem at all. I thought where I wanted to start off with is I've got the note that you spent 7 years as an actor. How did you find that and how did you get into acting?
Well, that's a good question to start with. How did I get into it? It was something I always wanted to do, but kind of secretly wanted to do as a child. I was quite shy and wasn't the sort of person that was at the front of the class and, that kind of thing. So it was sort of something I was always wanted to do. And I kind of, because I was, I guess, it was something that I think scared me. So it's something I decided I was going to do. And I applied for drama school, went to drama school, and it was brilliant. It's such a luxury to kind of spend time exploring other worlds and other characters and plays and all of that stuff. And I loved it. It was great.
Yeah. So did you pick that up as a young age and then apply for drama school post your sort of GCSEs level?
No, I didn't really do much as a kind of teenager. I did English A-level, and I was lucky enough to get into uni, and I did an English degree as a kind of, I guess, a safety thing. My thinking was, well, I should sort of have something else other than, kind of performing arts. So I went to university, and I did actually, it was at uni, I joined the Drama Society, and I did a couple of plays and I directed a play. And then I applied to drama school. So that was after uni. So it was like a postgrad after my degree.
Yeah. And what's your sort of favourite thing to play? Are you more into serious drama or are you more into musical shows?
Oh, yeah. No, not musicals. No, not. I mean, I love musicals, don't get me wrong. And I sort of drive my partner and kids mad with singing like Joseph in his amazing Technicolor Dreamcoat. Or mainly my partner because he doesn't like Andrew Lloyd Webber. But no, not musicals. I don't know. I don't think there's any one thing I love. It's kind of just when you have a kind of connection to a character, it's kind of magical, I guess. But I have to say, I did love comedy. I played Harriet Smith once from Jane Austen's Emma, and she's kind of this orphan sort of quirky girl. And she was quite fun. And then kind of towards the latter stages, I did some work on a play called The Container, which was about refugees and asylum seekers. And it was actually a site-specific piece. So it was set in an actual container, like a lorry container. And I played and we had an audience of 15. So the idea is that, you immerse the audience in that experience. Of these people that are being effectively people smuggled across Europe. And I played a woman from Afghanistan. And this is like 13 years ago, 2007. So I did at the time a lot of research about Afghanistan and the plight of women kind of under the Taliban. So it's been quite hard hearing what's been happening recently in that country, because I feel I have a bit of a personal connection because I did play this part and I did all this research and so that's been interesting. So a kind of mix of sort of comic sort of flights of fancy, if you like, and sort of serious bits and pieces. Yeah.
It's great that you were able to make a sort of living at it and be able to do it for a little while. How did you find being dyslexic worked within the acting world? Because I was sort of thinking visual thinkers would be great, but how have you got to learn lines and things like that, which would be harder work?
Yeah. And actually, this is sort of one of the areas I looked at when I went on to kind of do my research, which is sort of effectively looking at, how sort of dyslexia and the relationship between dyslexia and acting and what that experience is like. I think, like a lot of actors, like a lot of people with dyslexia, for whatever reason, you end up kind of going towards the thing that you love, but is the thing that's, I guess, easier than maths or whatever it was. And so you kind of think, well, and this is the experience I had, was that, when I went to university and I did an English degree, I had a study skills tutor who taught me how to write essays and, all that kind of thing. And I kind of thought, oh, that's it. I've done it now. I don't need to think about my dyslexia, tick, I've done that. I'm going to go and be an actor and I'm going to, effectively play and be other characters. That's got nothing to do with dyslexia. Everything, I won't have any kind of concerns, if you like. And I guess while I was working, obviously I met a lot of other actors that were dyslexic or dyspraxic because, they're very creative. They end up in these kind of people orientated or creative professions. And they and I guess, yeah, they all kind of had this, stress around line learning and about sight reading. But at the same time, were really, really imaginative and creative and were really in it and it kind of, I guess, embodied in their roles when they were acting. So yeah, I think like with anything, and it's like with any profession, when you're neurodiverse, there's a pattern of things that you're really, really good at. And there's things that are, challenging. And I think also at the time, I didn't realize it was because of the dyslexia. As I said, I'd kind of put the dyslexia in a neat sort of box, which was to do with spelling and structuring my essays. And I'd kind of dealt with that. So it was kind of a surprise when it kind of came back, if you like.
Yes.
In a good way. And also, well, in a great way, because it kind of spurred me on in terms of my future career, my interests. But yeah.
Okay. It's interesting because when you piqued my interest that you did an English degree, which my experience of learning English at school would be the very, very last thing I would have ever wanted to touch again. So
yes. And I listened to one of your previous podcasts with one of the guys who works in the NHS, and he's an accountant, and you both had this kind of like common experience of really not being into English and loving maths. And that's completely the opposite to my experience, which is a great example of how we're all so different. Well, I guess I loved, the thing about English is I don't think I ever finished reading an actual novel or a book throughout, my sort of secondary schooling. But English isn't just about books, it's about words. And, when you're looking at a poem, there's not so many words on the page, It's true. There's a lot of space around the words, and also in plays. And also, it's a kind of, at least for me, it's sort of a way into your imagination and all of that stuff that I like. And, for me, maths was about learning things in a linear way, having to remember stuff, wrote, kind of sequences and fractions. And I was like, I have no idea what you're talking about and I can't connect with it. And I'm sure that if I'd had a teacher that was, I'm not blaming it on the teaching. Well, I sort of am, obviously. But, I'm sure if it's taught in a certain way that is creative and imaginative and you connect to it, then it probably would have worked. And actually, the reason I got, thank God, a grade C in my GCSE maths was because I had a great tutor for the last 6 months who kind of sat me down and helped me to make sense of it. But without that, I was sort of facing an E in my maths. So yeah. And I had sorry, going on about English, but it's a really common story. I had a great English teacher who herself was dyslexic, so I had a really positive role model, and I love, my parents used to always take me to plays and stuff. So yeah, I know it's funny because when I applied for the degree, and at the time the student loan was funded through the local education authority, they actually came back and said, well, if she's dyslexic, why is she doing an English degree? I was like, what? Well, oh yeah, because obviously we're all the same and we all like maths, Yeah,
we are. Yeah, maths and science, obviously.
Yeah, exactly.
So what I'm taking really is that you enjoy the pattern and the use of words and what that escapism into a story does. So it allowed you to then power through maybe when you struggle with writing an essay or something later on?
I think so. I think it's that if you have an interest or if you have a personal connection to something, it's much easier to then write an essay on it. Whereas if if you're not interested in something or you haven't been able to make a connection with something, then it's harder to make it work, kind of thing. But yeah, I think there is something in there, and I found this with my research participants in my PhD, that for so many people who had a kind of difficult relationship with learning, that experience of performing has kind of given them something that they haven't actually maybe been able to experience in life, whether that's a kind of sense of control over what's happening, being able to kind of know what's coming next because you know your next line, or being someone else, a confident person, a person that's really good at reading or whatever it is, doesn't matter. But there's almost that kind of thing of performing that identity, I guess, that you haven't necessarily always experienced as a child.
Okay. And when did you find out you were dyslexic? It feels like you probably found out during your schooling time.
Yeah, I mean, my English teacher, who was dyslexic, kind of recognized it in me. So at about the age of 14 or 15, she said, "Oh, I'm pretty sure you are." But we didn't have any kind of way of formally diagnosing it. And then by the time I kind of got through to uni, I was literally the first person at the door of the dyslexia office list. I need a diagnosis. And I want an assessment. I know I am. Please, I need that. This is where I am. I've been going on so long, and I need something else now. I can't just rely on my strategies and my lovely English teacher. But yeah, so that was the kind of formal identification when I was sort of 19. But I mean it. And then when I went back to uni to do my PhD, I had another kind of formal diagnosis process, which was more all-encompassing. So with that, it wasn't just dyslexia. So then what was interesting is that it showed up that I had dyspraxia and visual stress, which actually made more sense of my experiences than the dyslexia. Because as you say, I was quite good at learning how to write an essay in the end, by the time I'd done it enough times. But some of the kind of, I guess, experiences that I'd had as an adult made more sense in relation to the dyspraxia and the visual stress. So it sort of helped for things to sort of click into place a little bit.
So when you found out in your first run at uni and you got formally statemented with dyslexia, did you start using any of the tools through university? What kind of things did you then put in place to help you through your degree?
It was sort of the early days of the DSA, so it wasn't as advanced as it is now. I remember having, in fact, I did find my old report. I think I had like 6 study skills sessions. So it was about, how to structure an essay, that sort of stuff. And I don't remember having any. I must have had some assistive technology because I know I had a laptop. I think I must have had some text to speech. Okay. Actually, sorry, I tell a lie. I remember now. I had Inspiration, which to this day I'm not a massive fan of. Sorry, Inspiration, if you're listening. But so I think it, doing mind maps sort of helped, and also it was actually more I find for me, it's more rather than doing everything on a computer, it's more the writing things out with an actual physical pen in your hand and color coding and highlighting. And I remember at uni, I used to have all my notes out and different piles in different colors for different parts of the essay, so it was much more kind of multi-sensory physical experience of doing something rather than just something that was sort of on a screen kind of thing.
Mm-hmm. Yes, I must admit, sometimes I tend to use the screens a lot, but actually having stuff out and about, like even the notes for this podcast are always written on paper, and I always have a notepad at work. There's something about physically writing it helps. I know quite a lot of people use OneNote on a Windows to help out with stuff, but I've never really got into it. I'm still always a notepad on the diary sat on the desk. And that's really important. I think when we, as don't get me wrong, amazing assistive technology is, and there's some bits of it that I literally couldn't work without it. But actually, if your instinct is to use pen and paper, there's a reason for that. And, whether it's because you need to kind of embody that learning process through,
writing is a physical act. You're using your pen, it's part of your body. And that helps you to make meaning out of whatever you're doing and helps you with your memory, all of that stuff. And often we're really quick to use technology. In my experience, obviously it's amazing, but sometimes it can actually, it can kind of distance you from the task in a way.
Yes. Yeah. I think I know what you mean. It's something about just the tactile experience of things versus stuff on a computer screen. I can't quite describe it, but there is something about that. Like working as an engineer, you can check drawings on a computer screen all day long, but there's something about printing them off, and I color code highlights and stuff I need to change, stuff that has been changed, stuff that's been approved, and things like that. And it's just that kind of physical, even the drawing in front of you really helps out.
Yeah. It's sort of more like I think it's more likely to imprint on your memory if you've gone through that process of writing it out, of colouring it. It's all part of getting it in, if you like. And I find the same with proofreading. I will pick up more things if I print it off and read it, even though it's the same. But there's something about holding it. Yeah, no, absolutely.
Yeah, very interesting. So you went to uni at 19 first, and then you went back into your PhD. What was that, late 20s?
Yeah.
So you'd have had good experience of a bit of work between, and then you already alluded to being reassessed. Was that with an educational psychologist before you dived into your PhD? Yes,
it was at the time.
Okay, and is that the full morning assessment grilling with all the shapes and
That's it.
Yeah, I'm familiar with that one, having gone to uni late myself. It's a really fascinating experience and one big headache later.
Yeah. And I think it's interesting because that sort of assessment process I went through, when I was 19, it was thorough in the sense that it was a dyslexia assessment. And so you either find dyslexia or you don't. But the one I had later was much more holistic. So it was more about looking at, if you like, the dyslexias or, dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc. So there was it was even more comprehensive. I mean, I sort of thought the one I had when I was 19 was comprehensive, but this was like really, so yeah, that was that.
Did you find, I found out that I got assessed at 6, so I didn't have a memory of being assessed until I got assessed at 25 for university. And even to this day, I find it really interesting reading what this person tells me about how my brain works and all of the things. Did you find the same, just being that much older, you would have remembered the first assessment, but you just knew more when you went into the second?
Yeah, I think it was like one of those aha moments that you have where things start to sort of make more sense, because it wasn't just about, I have a label, this is what it means, I've worked on that, it's, etc. It was much more about how you process information. And I found that so interesting. And it kind of started my whole research, really, that, dyslexia or whatever dyspraxia, neurodiversity is not a thing that's fixed. It's about how you process information. And having worked as an actor, acting is a process. There's sort of, all different processes. But I was sort of so interested then in how these two things that were seemingly separate were kind of interrelated. Because as I said before, in my sort of late teens, early 20s, I'd sort of put that to bed, and I'd been like, no, I've sorted out that dyslexia thing. I don't need to worry about that anymore. No, really, that's sort of what it was like.
Completed it.
Yeah, it was like, okay, tick, next. It sort of dominated my childhood for so long, even though I hadn't had a formal diagnosis. And then suddenly I got this report. And even though when you get that report, it's often, obviously it's written in that sort of medicalized language that does make you feel like you're completely inadequate, let's say. It's obviously only when you read other people's reports that you're like, oh, we're all like that. As in, you're all just, that is the language, and it's not a personal thing. It was, I remember when I had that first report, just being so relieved that at last, after sort of basically, 15 years, there was a reason, and I could work with it, and then when I had that second diagnosis, it was like, oh, wow. Oh, that's why. Like that kind of thing.
Yes, yeah. I remember kind of a silly moment, and it probably shows my thought processes about being dyslexic at the time. First of all, I couldn't believe all the universities accepted me. And then she gets to the end of the day and she's doing the IQ test thing.
Mm.
And I'm like, oh, cool. So she's like, well, you're here on the normal distribution curve, sort of near the right-hand side. I'm like, so I'm not stupid then. She's like, far from it, dyslexia lowers your score. I was like, oh, wow. Okay. And that started me slowly on the thought process that maybe I'm not as stupid as I've assigned myself to be.
Yeah. And that's what's great about having that, that assessment, is that you're like, oh, there's a reason. And it's not to do with intelligence. And actually there's a reason that you have these experiences, which are, because of how we school children, how we put them through an education system that sort of values literacy and working memory and still does, unfortunately.
Mm-hmm. Yes. So obviously then you had that second assessment, would have got DSA again, and you're doing your thesis on dyslexia and acting practice. So I want to sort of focus initially on the tools and then how your thoughts would have evolved as you were actually researching other dyslexic people during your PhD research.
Sure. Matthew, do you mind giving me like a more succinct question? Because I can't think. Tell me what you want me to say. Not what we do, but tell me. You know what I mean? Give me one question, because there's so many good questions. There's like 2 questions in there.
Okay, so first of all, you had your second dyslexia assessment. So now you're going into researching a PhD. How did you use the information of that and the DSA to set up how you were going to help yourself easily learn and write your PhD? So
I think by that point, I was kind of facing this big PhD and I was like, I need to kind of really make sure that I'm covered and that I can do this in a healthy way, not kind of surrounded by stress and anxiety and late nights of, writing and deadlines and all that. So I was really lucky. I had an amazing study skills tutor who really helped me, I think, move from this idea that you have to read everything and you have to know everything to more of you don't have to read everything. You need to learn how to skim read, and you need to use your kind of, I guess, dyslexic strengths in order to do that. You don't need to read from the beginning of something to the end. And that was sort of quite a revelation for me. I think it's a bit of a generalization, but I think people with dyslexia, not everyone, but me and lots of people I've met, have this kind of put reading and literature on a pedestal, like we do with Shakespeare. Like it's this thing that we can't access, that it's higher than us in some way because of our previous school experiences, let's say. And I definitely took that into my kind of academic career, where I felt I've got to read this entire article. I've got to read this entire book. I can't do it. I can't access it. All of those thoughts, those emotional thoughts that come along with that process. And actually, by kind of being taught a really good sort of skimming strategy, it sort of takes the book or the reading off at that pedestal, where it's much more about, I am in control of the book. The book doesn't control me. I'm going to take from the book what I want, because I don't need to know everything. So that was a real kind of shift for me, and it really helped me. I was introduced to screen masking for the first time, so screen tinting, and that was amazing. Even today, I use it, and I wouldn't be able to sort of look at a screen without having some form of screen tinting. And I got some support in terms of some funding to transcribe all my kind of workshops and interviews. So that was really useful, because otherwise you'd basically spend your whole time transcribing, and that would you could do a kind of PhD in transcribing before you actually got to your actual research.
I see. Yes.
Yeah. So the DSA were amazing. They basically funded someone to transcribe all my interviews, all my, workshops and stuff. And then I could take that kind of raw data, if you like, and kind of, start making sense of it. And also MindView. I mean, MindView is like amazing. I basically wrote my whole PhD on MindView, which I do prefer to inspiration. I am showing a preference, but there we go. It was great because, you're not sort of faced with that empty page, where you have to start from the beginning. You're just sort of faced with plonking ideas on a page and adding to it. And then eventually you get to export it into a Word document and you have a linear document and you're like, wow, I did that. I don't know how I did it, but it's amazing. Aren't I clever? So you have all those experiences and feelings. You're like, I can do this, and that's what you kind of need. I guess, that's sort of what I used through that process in terms of the DSA. So without the DSA, I wouldn't have been able to do a PhD. There's no doubt about that at all.
How did the idea of even partaking in the PhD come about? What sort of led you down that road?
So I think that, with me, and I think this is true with other people, when you're told you can't do something, that you just keep trying. So I never thought I'd go to uni. I was, for my mocks, I was getting, E's and D's. I was in the bottom set for basically everything apart from English. I thought I might go to college. Then I managed to scrape through my GCSEs. I got my A levels. Suddenly I ended up at uni, and so it's just seeing how far you can push the boundaries, I guess. And also, I think, doing a PhD is a big thing. And it's something I guess I thought I couldn't do. And, it's something other, isn't it? You're thinking, can I do that? That's something that other people do. And then in terms of where I got the idea, it was working in the profession. So it was very much a PhD based on my practice and my experience and talking to other actors and just seeing that there was a kind of, I guess, a gap in the training. There's a lot of really amazing acting tutors who work on voice and text and monologues and audition techniques. This is at the time. And there was a load of really, really good kind of dyslexia tutors or study skills tutors, but there wasn't really a link. There wasn't much going on in the middle, if you like. They weren't really connecting. So I was just so interested in what does that mean? What does that look like? And I found some really great supervisors at the University of Kent, Nicola Shaughnessy and Melissa Trimming in the drama department. They at the time were doing a big Arts Council funded project looking at using puppetry to support children with autism. So they were sort of in that neurodiverse creative space. And I sort of went to them with my proposal. And they were like really enthusiastic. And I was sort of like, oh, I think I've got something here, I was sort of, and so that, and I managed to get some funding, which is, alongside with the DSA, having funding for the actual PhD was, without that, I wouldn't have done the PhD. So, things just fell into place at sort of the right time.
How long did it take you to do the PhD?
So it took me 3 years, 11, and then I had some corrections. I had quite a few corrections actually, which I was expecting. I'm not proud, as in I'm not like, oh, I can't have corrections. I have to have a perfect thesis. I knew that there was going to be sort of issues. So I had my Viva, which is like, an exam, but it's a talking exam with your examiners where you have to kind of defend your work. And then I had another sort of 6 months to do those corrections to get it up to what they needed it to be to pass.
Oh, I see. Okay.
Yeah.
So I've been 3 years basically talking to a lot of different dyslexic people.
Yeah.
How did your thinking of it evolve as you went on? Because you would have had your own personal experience and some sort of anecdotal stuff from other people, but to formally kind of study dyslexia must have evolved your thoughts on it.
Yeah, very much. I think from the sort of theoretical side, I was still thinking about dyslexia at the beginning of the research as in that medical sort of language of deficit still, and looking at the kind of cognitive theories to explain it, which I actually find really interesting. Not being a psychologist or coming from that background, I love learning new things. So, I was really interested in it. But throughout the course of the research, particularly my supervisors sort of introduced me to looking at things from much more like a social perspective, looking at like the social model of disability and some sort of philosophies about how we often, when we talk about, let's say, dyslexia or a condition, what happens in that process is that you're medicalizing that individual and you're kind of making them passive because you're doing something to them, like whether you're giving them an intervention or medicine or whatever it is. Whereas there's in this kind of philosophy drama perspective, there's this theory and it's called phenomenology, and it's basically about how you look at people's individual perceptions and their experience of being in the world as valid in themselves, it's not just about medicalizing somebody. So it was very much moving from that kind of, I guess, medical language and deficit theory to much more about people's embodied experiences and individual perceptions. And there hasn't still been that much published research about the kind of social, looking at dyslexia from a sociological perspective or an embodied perspective. It's still much more about, neurocognition and the brain and how it functions and how that affects people, but not necessarily about individual perceptions and about, the interaction with the environment and stuff. So I got more into that side of things, which was really interesting. And obviously it being in a drama department, it's all about the body because acting is a physical thing. It's not just in the brain. So it sort of fits quite nicely in that discipline. And then in terms of I spent a lot of time talking to people, listening to people, which I think is something I think I'm quite good at listening. It's quite a crucial part of my job, is listening. I think, a lot of the stories or the sort of narrative is about the reason why you become an actor. And a lot of it is about what we sort of talked about. It's about moving from an identity of being kind of other. So of being someone that can't do something or has difficulty in school or can't access text, to somebody that is on stage and feels something that they don't feel in life, whether that's confidence or, they feel in control or whatever it was. So there was all that kind of narrative around transforming their self-concept, I guess, in a really, really positive way. And also, I think in terms of the sort of idiosyncratic and all the such interesting strategies they developed themselves to kind of get to where they were. Which were kind of, I guess, outside of what they were necessarily being taught at drama school. There was a lot of, I can give you a couple more anecdotes if you want, but there was just a lot of vivid descriptions of their process and their experiences. And it's, effectively it's storytelling, just like a play. I found it so fascinating.
How did you find it comparing to your experiences? Did it enhance your sort of thoughts of your own dyslexic brain?
It was interesting because a lot of them, in fact, the majority, I mean, again, I only did a small scale study. I think I had about 30 participants. So I can't, I'm not saying this is, we can talk about everybody, but I'd say the majority of my participants talked about having difficulty with a particular technique, an acting technique that's used quite often, and they didn't like it. And I could totally understand, not they didn't like it, but they just couldn't access it. And which was so interesting because that was completely the opposite of my experience, because I love that technique and it helped me. So right. In that experience, obviously I'm not, in that moment, I'm thinking, oh, that's, even though, and that's in a way also it's slightly contradictory, because in an article I published, it's all about this technique. And the technique, I'll give you a really brief thing, is called actioning the text, which is basically in every interaction you have. So say say my line to you, you're my scene partner, Matthew, and my line is,
okay.
Don't do that. And the action I'm playing, which is kind of like the verb, they call it, just like, in school. I need to do a kind of an action on that. So I'm doing something to you, like I'm affecting you. So when I say don't do that, I might be belittling you. Yeah. So that's an example of a verb, an active verb. I'm belittling you. And that kind of determines the energy or the tone that goes on between me and you, let's say, or in that moment. Yeah. I don't know if I'm making any sense, but that's
you are. Yeah, I'm following.
Yeah. So that technique, and I still argue this, and I agree with it, even though it's different to my experience, is that technique is predicated on having that linguistic, that ability to pick up a word like, belittle or befuddle or tease and apply it to a particular piece of text. So that's very much an intellectual, not intellect, but a brain exercise, because it's about labeling, it's not a physical activity. It's not a physical exercise where you're up on your feet and you're maybe, I don't know, using gestures to help you get out your thought or whatever. And they pretty much all were like, I can't stand actions. And this is, this was a technique that was pretty much ground in at drama school, that, you need to action your text. Every line had to have an action attributed to it. So, it was just really interesting, because I always actually found that helped me, because sometimes I'd be totally lost and I'd actually need something to ground me, and the word actually helped me. But I think that might potentially be more to do with my dyspraxia, because from some of the reading I've done in the more recent years, I think if you are dyspraxic, then you tend to have have a bit more sort of grasp of vocabulary and that sort of stuff. So that might be why. I don't know. But it was interesting, because I was kind of expecting them, us all to be the same, and we weren't, of course.
No,
we all had different experiences.
Yeah. What was your next move once you'd got your doctorate, apart from changing all the letterheads?
What was my next move? I published some articles. I worked for a couple of years as a study skills tutor, both in universities and also as a kind of dyslexia tutor within drama school. So it was very much applying what I'd learned throughout my PhD, in a coaching practice, and also at the Actors Centre, which is it was a kind of continuing development training place for professional actors. I then had some children, which kind of takes up a lot of your time. So, that kind of gave me that headspace sometimes you need when you're really immersed in your research and your work. So, and then I actually got, interestingly, a kind of an offer of a job working in a different context, which was working in a more of a workplace, looking at doing strategy coaching, not for actors, but for professionals, and also workplace needs assessment. So that kind of opened my eyes to that side of things, having not gone through that, I guess, corporate world or graduate scheme or office job as, in my 20s and 30s. It's just so interesting to me. In a way that it might not be interesting to other people who've been doing it for that long. But it interests me how, people work, how people, function or process information in that environment. And thinking about, what I can draw from my research.
Yes. Yeah. You must be interesting if you barely worked in an office environment. I didn't start working until my 30s. You sit under strip lights all day and stare at screens, and it's all square rooms, or at least the places I've always worked in are. So yeah, must have been a bit of a shock. Is that what led you to your current position at Dyslexia Box then?
Yeah, I mean, I initially was working for an occupational health provider, PAM, and I would go in to do strategy coaching and workplace needs assessments into sort of government departments. And also, I think, the thing is that, I don't know if you find this, but I think people, again, I know everything I say, I feel like I have to sort of qualify it because it sounds like a massive generalization, but I do think that people with dyslexia, they sort of pick up information from all different random sources, and they're really good at, they're quite nosy because they like knowing new things. And I just that's what I loved about strategy coaching and workplace needs assessments when you were face to face, because you would go into all these like workplaces that you wouldn't necessarily have access to. So I was going into like the Cabinet Office and the Department for Work and Pensions and, all this. Okay. It was really...
Is it all wood cladded?
That's it. But it might also, it might just still be the actor in me, and that it's, it's just about other worlds and exploring and all that. So I loved it. And then I got a role working for Leveroy, who have a contract with the BBC. So I did workplace assessments for BBC employees, which by that point we were in the pandemic, so it was all remote delivery. And then from there, that's where I've kind of ended up at Dyslexia Box, which is since last year May I've been with them. So yeah, that's my journey.
Yeah. So can you give us a quick sort of elevator pitch on what Dyslexia Box is?
Yeah, absolutely. So we're a workplace adjustment provider. So we provide assessments, assistive technology, training and coaching, and technical support. And on top of that, we run a number of initiatives to kind of support people in the workplace and also stakeholders. So, for example, we have really good relationships with Access to Work assessors, and we run a monthly kind of drop-in session for them. Often as a workplace assessor, I've been one. Sorry, I realise this is meant to be an elevator pitch and it's just jabbering on. But anyway, there we go.
Yeah, we're going up a really tall building. You can carry on.
Anyway, so yeah, we run a number of of initiatives to sort of support our stakeholders and our clients. So sort of drop-in sessions for Access to Work assessors, and we've also started offering a HR neurodiversity clinic. So this is for HR professionals or line managers to come and have a conversation about, employees in the workplace, how to make the environment more inclusive, all of those sorts of things. And we also support our coaches because we have a large service delivery team who work self-employed, and often what I found when I was a coach is that you do all this great work, but you don't have anywhere to kind of share it or to get sort of development, help kind of thing. So yeah, it's an opportunity for coaches to come, and we do sort of troubleshooting from any issues they might have with a client, sharing what's happened, looking at sort of training opportunities, all that sort of stuff. So yeah, we do a number of things. We're also a founding organisation of the Dyslexia Show and the lead sponsor of the workplace area. So we work a lot with Aaron Smith, and we'll be there, which I think you will be as well, Matt, at the Dyslexia Show at the end of March. That's us.
Yeah, it's going to be my first time not talking into a webcam, which is going to be interesting.
Oh yes.
That's going to be a bit of a milestone. So you're saying about doing a lot of workplace coaching and assessment. How are you finding workplaces are evolving, or how are they engaging with dyslexia and neurodiversity now? Because I've found it's changed and shifted quite a bit in terms of how it's more seen as a positive thing now rather than just kind of what it was before. And I wondered how being involved in that, whether you have to hard sell it to companies or whether they are really super engaged.
That's a good question. I think it's sort of a tale of two tales, or there's two sides, isn't there? I think there's I know what I mean, but I can't think of the phrase. I think on the one hand, you've got a lot of positive talk and initiatives around talking about neurodiversity and the positive aspects. And, dyslexia is a competitive advantage. And there's some great organizations that have recently been formed, like Neurodiversity in Business and the Institute of Neurodiversity. So that's all great because it's saying neurodiversity is a thing and it's great and we need to talk about it. And it's something that you as the employer need to know about. And I think, pretty much, a lot of people, a lot of HR managers or line managers, yes, they have experience of neurodiversity through maybe a child or a friend or, et cetera, et cetera. So it's something that is becoming easier to talk about. I don't know if it's easier to disclose, and I'd like to think that all that work is making it easier to disclose. I think, we're in our work is about supporting people through that workplace adjustments process. Not always, but I'd say the majority of the time, people are coming to us because there's a performance management issue. And therefore, what you're getting at the beginning is resistance from that line manager because that person with neurodiversity is deemed to have, quote unquote, a problem. So I think that while there's a lot of amazing work going on, it still needs to be fed through to kind of grassroots, to kind of the day-to-day operations of companies. Because not everybody has a massive budget like, Ernest Young with the Neurodiversity Excellence Forum or whatever, They
get mentioned a lot in this podcast.
I'm sure. Yeah. And it's amazing. And, that would have never been the case even 5 years ago. But, people have a lot of different jobs and in a lot of different companies of big and small sizes. And so I just still think there's just so much, and this is obviously the case in the whole kind of diversity and inclusion landscape. There's so much more that needs to be done. And I think we're going in the right direction.
Yes, I think I agree. And it is slowly moving. It's interesting now because I apply for a job and it's sat on my CV that I do this podcast and run a website. So I will get asked in an interview, and it's really interesting hearing how people are different now compared to 10 years ago. I also do work in completely different industries, so that it's hard to completely compare. So if you're going in and coaching in a company and you do find it's a line manager who thinks there's, should we say, a problem or a deficit, how do you go about shifting their thinking on it?
So, there's a number of practical things we can do. One is, depending on the recommendations in an assessment report, we might go in and deliver neurodiversity awareness training. We might deliver co-coaching, which is between the line manager and the individual. We might, invite them to events, like we did recently, where we're talking about neurodiversity, what it is, the positive aspects, what it can bring to your business. It's hard because I think a lot of the barriers that people experience they're outside of themselves. So there are things that actually are systemic in that organization. And therefore I can do a report and I can make recommendations for that individual to change how they do things, to change how that line manager or the team does it. But without someone saying yes or pushing that button to make change, there's only so much, I think, sometimes it can be achieved. And then it's a case of when you're supporting an employee, are you supporting them, which often, maybe a strategy coach might help them with, looking at what are the other options in terms of a role that's more suited to them, either within that company or somewhere else, self-employment opportunities, all these new, the internet has kind of created this amazing space where people can make their own work and their own business models. And, there's an argument that is really, really well suited to people with neurodiversity. That's sort of reflected in the amount of entrepreneurs with dyslexia.
Mm-hmm.
So yeah, sort of a lot of different stuff going on.
Yes, yeah, and it's great that there's organisations that help that. Do you find any particular industries more turned on, or more certain departments to it than others, or is there no kind of correlation there?
I think on the whole, HR was becoming more turned on to it because it's becoming a part of that inclusion and diversity agenda, and that's a big and D&I sits within the HR departments. So there's a lot of buy-in from HR in terms of supporting employees, wanting to know more about it, and that's sort of the first stage, is having people that actually really want to know, and it's great. And also creating, employee resource groups for, people to come together and talk about how they work. I think it's so hard to say one industry over another. I can't answer that. I'd love to, but I'm sure there's some research that probably, or maybe there will be some research in the future, but I can't say definite one or the other. I think it's just it's a mixed picture.
Yes, yeah. I was wondering, my gut feeling on it was it'd be all the STEM industries, just because they may have more neurodiverse people in it. I was curious to see if that was kind of coming out at your end, but you being a dyslexic person or a neurodiverse person who doesn't necessarily like STEM is interesting in the first place.
I know. I knew you picked that up. Yeah, I know. It's not that I don't like it, but yeah.
So, one thing I wanted you to ask is, obviously you've got a big background in acting, and now you work more as a kind of coach into the corporate world. How are you using the skills gained from the acting side of it to help with this job? Are you sort of managing to bolt the two together?
I try to. I think obviously having that background, and also, having had a study skills tutor for myself, a lot of strategies can be quite sort of sitting down, thinking, writing stuff. So I do try to make it as kind of grounded or physical as possible, which I think helps, particularly with people with sort of sensory overload, ADHD, dyslexia, dyspraxia, etc. So I guess like some of the stuff I use would be stuff I might use if I was doing like a warm up in an acting workshop. Stuff like, I think often, that experience of being neurodiverse in a workplace, there's often a sort of stress that comes with that. So I try and work sort of physically, like through the body. So like one thing I might ask that client to do is actually to take their shoes off, so that, they are actually having a physical connection with the ground. So it's not just, always having shoes kind of thing. And just walk around the space with their with their socks or not with their socks. So it's just about trying to ground them through their feet. And also looking at where you've got stress or anxiety, encouraging them, working with them to do a kind of body audit. So this is like thinking about, well, where do you hold stress in your body? Because often, say we're going into a presentation or a meeting, we're worried about something. Stress, we know, has an impact on our working memory. So how can we reduce our stress levels? So it's very much, instead of thinking about stress as an intellectual thing, I need to de-stress, it's how can we, so it's basically using the body to reduce our stress levels. So we might do some what we call, I guess, physical freeing exercises. So often we hold stress. It might be in the shoulders or the jaw. So sort of tensing those areas and releasing them, so that you're getting that physical sense of release in your body. We might also do some like mindfulness exercises where you're asking them to focus on specific things. So like there's this really great exercise called the 5 senses exercise, where you ask the client to focus on their breathing, and then you ask them to kind of name 3 things that they see. They can tell you these things verbally, or they can just say it in their head, and then to name 3 things that they smell, 3 things that they can taste, what things that they hear, 3 things that they hear, etc. And then it's about having that conversation about, well, why was that? What is that exercise helpful? And if it is, why? What senses were you able to access more easily than others? So it's kind of a mindfulness exercise, to focus them on the moment. So it's interesting because I think, as I said, rather than thinking about reducing stress, I need to reduce stress. Well, how? It's much more about having practical strategies, and a lot of that, particularly around the body and physical exercises, is what you do as an actor to kind of get ready to perform. So yeah, there's a lot of obviously correlation.
How it's going to be a bit of a generalisation, but how do you coach dyslexic actors? What sort of things do they normally need help with to get better at their job or hobby?
So that's a good question. So, I mean, there's two sides of it. One is the skills side, so teaching specific skills. And the other side is the working on confidence. So the skills are around improving their skills in line learning, sight reading. Sight reading is a really big strategy that you need to be good at in order to do a good audition, or, it doesn't necessarily mean you're a good actor, but it's like a skill you need to learn. And frequently, or these days, actually, even at the point of a casting, it's considered to be better to be off book. So to have already learned your lines. So that has, potential challenges. And then there's work around, the sort of confidence or self-concept aspect of it as well. So, and obviously the two go hand in hand. So
how do you coach sight reading? Because having to read stuff out loud cold is one of my weaker points, and let alone trying to do it with any inflection because I'm doing an audition for a role. I mean, I struggled to read lyrics and sing along.
Yeah, I know.
But
it's really tricky. I know. Yeah. So I think what I tend to do is, so one of the things I found in my research was that when an actor was going to an audition, they were getting this script, and all they would do is, in that time they had to prepare, if they were lucky enough to have time, what they would do is they would look through the script and they would look at all the words they didn't know, and all the words they didn't know what they meant or how to pronounce them. And they would kind of hyper focus on the things they didn't know. And of course, it meant that when that casting director opened the door and said, "Oh, you're next," they'd be like, I've no idea who the character is, where I am, what the circumstances are. I've got nothing. One of the actors I really distinctly remember saying he had to go and ask receptionist, "How do you pronounce this word?" or that he would Google it, all that stuff. So, it's moving them from that sort of bottom up approach of the individual words, because that's what they're most concerned with. And often you focus on the things you're most concerned with because that's where your brain goes, to actually thinking about the text more as a kind of big picture. So what does it look like on the page? Are we looking at big chunks of text? Is it, who is the character? I would get them to look at the first line first, and then the last line, so that what you're getting is an overview of the text and maybe a sense of the journey. And also really encouraging them to use those dyslexic reading strengths of using kind of guesswork and context as much as possible. So it's not about the individual meaning of the words. If a casting director wants a word perfect reading, then they could get kind of Alexa to read something out. But if they want somebody to read with connection and, intention and purpose and, whatever, all of those things that we think acting is, then it's about something more than just the individual words. So it's much more about, getting them to kind of just make quick choices about who is this person, where are they, asking questions of the text, going back to what I said earlier about being a kind of active reader. And sometimes just having that mindset, just shifting that mindset can sort of, then they don't worry about if I mispronounce something or they don't know what it means. And also just, physical things you can do with the page. So rather than looking at the whole page, dividing it up, so folding it so that you're only looking at certain bits at a time as you're reading it, so that you don't miss your place. Supporting them with, often when with acting anyway, they say acting is reacting. It's, what they're looking for is that reaction shot, particularly in casting, in television casting. So it's much more about listening and reacting to what is being said. And actually, there's no rush to come in with the next line and for it to be perfect. It's better if you let that line settle and you give yourself that space to come back with that line. And if you don't know the line or you're confused, just make it part of the character. Characters are just people like us.
Oh yeah, so it's all really interesting stuff, because it does leave me, I'm thinking about it, like, actually you're totally right, that you could just get a virtual assistant to read it word for word perfectly, but that's not really what the caster is looking for, and actually shaking people's mind out of that. I imagine it's a different animal when you get to the point where you've got the script and now you're having to talk it out loud once you've got the job and you're doing the scene, because that now needs the right words.
Yeah. And I think, often, at least it used to be the case, I think it is changing now, but, the first day of rehearsal would always be it would be a read through, which would literally be sitting around, on a chair in a circle, and you would read out the script. And that's something that has been the source of a lot of anxiety over not being able to pronounce things, or not, or reading out loud, because it goes back to that experience of being in school and, the teacher saying, can you read this out loud? And you can't. That is changing now, and they're thinking about, well, how, does that really help? What does that do? Do we really need to have a read through at the beginning? Can we do things in different ways? Which I guess is, part of what my research was about, and other people's research is about, what is good practice in that context, in that context of, training, acting training, or the industry. Do you need to do it this way? And it's the same in any job. Just because things are always done this way, you have a process or you have a workflow. Why? As in, can you not change things? Doesn't always have to be done in that way. And I think often as an employee, you're kind of, I suppose it depends on what level you come in at, but you're expected to kind of fit into somebody else's process. And that can be difficult.
Yes, yeah, I agree. And I think processes are important to capture best practice, but sometimes processes are just a legacy thing from whoever first did it. And if they're not from a neurodiverse background, and also sometimes being neurodiverse, you do spot patterns and like, well, why are we doing it like this?
Yeah, exactly. Because often you can sort of see what's, the bigger picture. And, the sort of, old adage that, what's good for dyslexia or neurodiversity, without wanting to lump everyone together, but is good for everybody, as in, it might be that if we change, hopefully if you change things in certain ways, it could benefit everybody, whether you're neurodiverse or not. Why wouldn't you want to do that?
Yeah, I think I completely agree with you there. And the simple example is all the assistive technology that comes out that's just normal stuff now, like having a button to close the boot on your car and things like that.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
Okay, so I'm going to start rounding the podcast down now. You've alluded to listening to previous episodes. You might know all the rapid fire questions already. So, question number 1. They don't need rapid fire answers for you, by the way. Is what prejudice would you have had about dyslexia that has been proven wrong?
That it's just to do with spelling and writing an essay.
Yes. Yeah. If an alien come down and asked you what dyslexia was, how would you describe it to them?
That it's a way of processing information, sort of like a learning style, but not fixed. It can change.
Yes. And the last one of the podcast, as this is the Dyslexia Life Hacks show, do you have any good dyslexia life hacks?
I mean, I don't know if it's, my using screen masking. I know that's not mine and I haven't made it, unfortunately, but that still helps me. I can't do without that. That's amazing.
So is that a physical mask over the screen, or do you have a program on the computer that changes its color scheme?
So I have, at the moment, I've got a program. So I've got Claro, and they have a screen tinter that uses that. But I have had, overlays in the past, and that's really helped. And I mean, it's hard to boil down to one hack, isn't it? I guess. Yeah. I guess the thing about with reading or anything, it's about just trying to take the big picture, like, play to your strengths, which is, there's a lot of research that suggests that as people with dyslexia they read by sort of using context and guesswork, and that actually that's what you should do. Don't think that you need to do what other people do. Yeah. Don't think you have to read the whole book. That's my hack.
Yes. It brings you back, actually. We were talking about EdPsych assessments earlier. I remember getting a paragraph to read out loud that I read wrong. And then you get asked a load of context questions afterwards. And I was in the high percentile for that. And the comment is, I don't know how he manages to do that because he read the whole thing completely wrong and got it more right than most people. So.
Yeah, that's probably why. Yeah, exactly. Because you inferred the meaning and the connections and all that. Just because on that sort of word level, you got some words wrong, doesn't really matter because you still knew what the gist was.
Yes, my comprehension was really good. Just the reading out loud was not at all in that particular time in my life. Okay, is there anything you'd like to share or say to the audience before we sign off?
Well, that's a nice open question.
It is indeed.
Thanks for having me. And okay. I hope I haven't talked too much. And please get in touch with me at Dyslexia Box if you'd like to. My email is deborah@dyslexiabox.co.uk. If you'd like to talk about anything that we've talked about today, or if we can support you with your workplace adjustment journey, please get in touch. We're obviously, I'm going to say we're really good, but we genuinely are. The guys in the office are really, really good at solving problems, making things really easy, which sometimes that workplace adjustment process, can be, it can be a bit fraught, but yeah. They're really good with smoothing everything over.
Well, that's great to hear. And I want to thank everybody for I want to thank you first for taking the time to come on the podcast. And I want to thank everybody else for listening. And I will see you guys in the next episode. Goodbye for now.